Coming up on Arirang News, the fourth wave of the coronavirus in South Korea is posing risks to the country's GDP growth target this year of 4.2%. Consumer sentiment is down as the strict distancing rules deal another blow to spending. The authorities decide to extend the distancing rules in South Korea as the country continues to see more than 2,000 cases of COVID-19 a day. Restaurants now will have to stop serving customers inside an hour earlier at 9 p.m. And with vaccine appointments open to adults under 50 in South Korea, data show more than 61% have made their reservations. When the first shots are given next week, they'll be getting doses of the Pfizer vaccine. It's 5 o'clock p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korea has been seeing some strong economic indicators in recent months, leading to a higher and higher GDP growth forecast for this year. But with the fourth wave of the virus and stricter distancing, consumer demand is likely to take a big hit. The growth target, though, still could be achievable. Kim Sung-min reports.
While South Korea's major economic indicators have been showing positive signs of recovery for the past few months, downside risks from the pandemic's fourth wave continue to dampen the bright outlook.
The country's economy has been seeing robust exports and an improvement in employment, but with the resurgence of the virus, uncertainty is growing, especially in the local economy around in-person services.
In its monthly economic report on Friday, the Finance Ministry noted that local demand in particular could take a hit. Consumer sentiment in July dipped for the first time since December, putting an end to the continuous increases over the past 6 months. But this latest drop in sentiment has not yet been reflected in the data. Just looking at some of the indices, there were some mixed trends with credit card spending growing almost 8% last month compared to a year ago. The ministry said it'll take some time for the data to fully reflect the impact of the latest wave of infections. The report also noted that the global COVID-19 situation as well as inflation pose further risks. So with all the risks, can we still expect South Korea to achieve the 4.2% growth this year as the government forecast earlier? Experts say there are some reasons for that positive outlook.
With the exchange rate surging, exports are forecast to continue on the current upward trend. And with the government's expansionary fiscal policies, the goal of achieving 4% is likely to be achieved.
Exports in July rose almost 30% from the previous year, and the latest overall industrial output jumped 6.7% on year. To maintain the current recovery trend and reduce risks, the ministry pledged for full efforts in cushioning the possible hit of the strict virus prevention measures. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
South Korea's biggest companies increased their investment in their businesses in the first half of this year by nearly 5% compared to a year earlier, according to a report assessing 332 companies by Corporate Tracker CEO Score. They invested around $70 billion. That's an increase on year of about $3 billion, or 4.6% on year, and an increase from 2019 of almost 13%. That was driven largely by chip makers Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix. Pharmaceutical firms were another big factor. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news on this Friday, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon. Thanks for coming on today.
Good afternoon.
Well, stocks in New York overnight had a little bit of a bump after the big drop the day before. That's aside from the Dow showing another decline. Investors are still nervous about the Fed tapering its asset purchases and when that starts. Unemployment claims coming in lower than expected. What's the story in the global markets?
Yes, if you look at the U.S. market, it did quite reasonably well despite the news of the tapering. The Fed minute came out and it indicated that they will be doing tapering probably within this year. And because of that news, it was very much similar to 2013 taper tandem where we saw market declining by somewhere between 6 to 7% for S&P and NASDAQ during a 1 month of period with that news coming in 2013. And with that, we did see U.S. market falling quite sharply the day before. And then yesterday, it started with more than 1% down, but it did recover quite nicely. So the reason for that is probably because usually you buy into the news, and usually when the news hits the market, it seems that the people have been already anticipated this, and therefore the implication for the U.S. market was not that significant. And all in all, if you look at the NASDAQ, it was up by about 0.1%. S&P 500 was up by 0.13%. And the reason for this is because earnings coming through, and it shows a quite strong number. NVIDIA numbers were good, and also Netflix and Microsoft all seems to show quite reasonably good price performance yesterday. Even though there are some worries about the COVID-19 cases in U.S. And a sharp drop of the commodity prices, and also with this tapering news, people are quite cautious for the time being. And also the seasonality factor is such that during August and September tends to show somewhat of technical correction for U.S. market in most of the cases. So it seems that the tapering with the technicality hitting together, resulting into some of the volatility rise. If you look at the VIX numbers, it did sharply rise from around 15 level to now as high as 22 plus. So clearly volatility is back, and people are quite cautious for the time being. But if you look at the overall fundamentals, we think that the U.S. market still remains to be quite resilient relative to other markets.
And today in Korea, the Kospi and the Kosdaq took another beating. Investors here, too, worried about tapering. Foreign investors, above all, continuing to sell big time. The Kospi now down from its peak last month of 3,300 to well below 3,100. Tell us about the domestic market.
Yes, it seems that Korea is also repeating what we saw in 2013 taper tandem. When you look at the Korea market during that period of time of 2013, it did fall more than twice of what U.S. market correction showed during that period of time. So from peak to bottom, Korean market did corrected by more than 12% during that period of taper tandem. Right now, from the peak to bottom right now, the Korean market corrected more than 6%, close to 7% now. Clearly, it's about half of what the correction is. If the U.S. market correction finishes with the recent only 2-3% correction, then once again, I think that Korea is also in a quite good room for recovery coming through in the future. What matters the most is not whether or not the tapering happens within this year. A more important factor is when the interest rate will be raised. I think that Korea seems to be much more cautious because BOK have been mentioning that they'll be raising interest rate if the Fed is tightening measures are coming through faster than expected. So if so, then the people are quite cautious about Korea, and also even U.S. investors or foreign investors with this kind of news coming through, which is not positively in favor of the equity market, they seem to be selling into the market. However, if you look at the correction today, it seems that it's quite a bit of a weakness because the domestic retail investors' net purchasing is not rapidly picking up. I think that they've been buying continuously for the time being, and then they've been suffering with the correction that we saw in the recently, and therefore they're quite cautious at the current point in time. However, we think the liquidity condition within Korea is still very ample, and the fundamentals are quite strong, and therefore the correction is not going to be a long-lasting type of correction. It should be more of a month type of correction, so it should be short-lived in our view.
Right, and the tapering question is hitting oil prices too. Oil down for a sixth session in a row to its lowest level since May. And not only the possibility of stimulus being reduced, but also a hit to demand from the virus. What do you see happening with oil right now and going forward?
Right. I've been saying that the oil prices hitting $77 per barrel was too high. That number was coming in, and that number was as high as 2018 peak. We did talk about how, in terms of the increase in productions or rig count increases, were much lower than the period of 2018. So the reason why the prices were picking up to the level of similar to 2018 was due to controlling the supply rather than demand picking up so significantly. So once again, we think that the overall supply side is remained to be very, very ample, basis on the shale gas production as well as the overall production by the OPEC plus. So I think that what really need to see for the oil price to show above $70 plus will be a very strong demand picture. But for the time being, the demand was coming in with the COVID-19 resulting into quite a weakness and recovering quite sharply due to people are coming back to the work and the summer seasons where the oil demand tends to go high because of driving seasons. So all that has resulted into the shale price, oil price rising as high as $77. But once again, if you look at on a fundamental basis of supply and demand picture, we don't think that oil can be going up rapidly, but rather should be in a box trading range. And I've been always saying that the oil should be somewhere between $65 to the $75 of trading range based on supply and demand picture. We think that that should be continuing, meaning that with the oil price now falling to below $65, we think probably the oil price is at the lower end of the picture. Therefore, we think that the oil price should be fairly stabilizing in the future. Even so, I think that though it's not going to be in a period where people have been saying that oil price might go up to $100 by the end of the year, which obviously is not happening right now. So all in all, we think that trading range should be what would be the future of the oil prices.
And finally, Mr. Yu, a domestic question here. Some changes to property taxes in Korea. Home prices have obviously risen quite dramatically in the past few years. And so some people have found themselves with a much bigger tax bill because the value of their homes have risen. So the lawmakers have agreed to raise the threshold on this tax for people so that it kicks in at a higher level than it does now. Some are saying, though, that this actually could work against the government's efforts to cool the market down. Tell us about that in your view.
Well, I think that a lot of these regulatory measures regarding the property market seems to be quite disturbing or quite unreasonable per se. In order for the market prices to correct, you need much more open market, and also the level of the tax issue should be in a such that the trading can be actively happening. And also, in order to control the prices, it should not be the basis on taxes or regulatory environment, but rather it should be based on the overall supply and demand side. We need to see much bigger supply picture and to show the overall so-called the first-time buyer of Korea to be not panicking on the prices rising, but rather the trading volume should be remaining quite active. But with these, a lot of the investors or holding the property owners, they are basically saying that, oh, there's more taxes, then we're just not going to sell it. So if that's the case, then there's no supply coming through, and therefore the prices keep going up. So we need to see some kind of measures where it can create better trading volume and somehow transfer that the value of the property into, say, equity market. We talked about this before. Overall, I think that the property owners are a very small percentage of the population, and they have ample amount of money. So therefore, they can bear this kind of tax regime period. So if that's the case, then we're not going to see property price coming down as what government wants to see. And with the lower volume, we think the price can even go up even higher. So I think that these are the things that we need to worry about. We need to see much more market-oriented regulatory measures or some kind of measures to benefit tax rate rather than keep putting on higher taxes, creating lower volume trading and creating bigger problems.
So open up the market, and that would help this imbalance clear through the market. That would be certainly an alternative from what the government's been pursuing so far. Mr. Yu, we appreciate your insights on that subject and everything else. As always, have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.
South Korea continues to report more than 2,000 cases of COVID-19 a day, and so the authorities have decided to extend the current distancing rules by another 2 weeks, with the additional rule that cafes and restaurants now have to close even earlier, at 9 p.m. instead of 10. Also, that'll be the latest time that convenience stores can let customers eat or drink in the store. Lee Kyung-eun has the details.
South Korea reported a total of 2,052 cases on Friday, the third highest number of cases since the start of the pandemic. And despite vaccinations picking up pace, the government has ruled out any easing of restrictions. Authorities say since the more transmissible Delta variant appeared, vaccines alone are not enough to contain the virus.
So far, no country has succeeded in returning to pre-COVID by raising vaccination rates and easing restrictions at the same time.
With that, the government has decided to extend the current restrictions for another 2 weeks until September 5th. So the capital region will remain under the highest level 4 distancing measures, while the rest of the country is under level 3. And as an additional measure in level 4 areas, cafes and restaurants will need to close by 9 p.m., 1 hour earlier than they do now.
We've taken into consideration that cafes and restaurants account for 30% of cluster infections, and that it is hard to keep face masks on there.
Convenience stores will be treated in the same way as restaurants, so people cannot eat or drink there after 9 p.m. in level 4 areas or after 10 p.m. in level 3 areas. Private gathering rules will remain the same, but one vaccination incentive has been reintroduced in level 4 areas, allowing up to 4 people to meet after 6 p.m. if 2 of them are fully vaccinated. Also, quarantine guidelines will be toughened at the borders. Up until now, fully vaccinated entrants to the country were exempt from the mandatory 2-week self-quarantine. But starting September, that benefit will no longer apply to those coming in from countries where variants of concern prevail. And Peru has been added to the list of 36 countries due to the Lambda variant. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
And since vaccine reservations opened last week in South Korea for adults under 50, shots have been booked by more than 61% of people in that age group. According to the KDCA, the highest reservation rate is among those in their 40s at almost 68%, followed by those in their 20s, while the lowest rate was among 30-somethings at 54%. The 61% figure is for the general public, but counting those in priority groups like essential workers, the rate is actually around 77%. Vaccinations will start next Thursday, and that week people will get the Pfizer shot. The authorities say that by the end of the month, around 26% of the population will be fully vaccinated, and then 47% by the end of next month. Currently, a little under 22% are vaccinated fully, and more than 48% have gotten their first dose. In Afghanistan, Taliban militants have been putting down protests against their rule, killing at least 2 people. They're reportedly hunting down locals who worked with U.S. and NATO forces prior to the takeover, despite earlier promises of an amnesty. The U.S. is trying to evacuate thousands of people a day, but they're reportedly falling short of their goal. Min Soo-kyun reports.
Afghanistan protesters continue to take to the streets across many parts of the country, defying the Taliban for the second day on Thursday while waving their national flag and chanting, "God is greatest." The demonstrations came as Afghans celebrated Independence Day, commemorating the end of British rule in the country. However, celebrations were met with gunfire as the militant group killed at least 2 people and left dozens wounded. Following its swift takeover of Afghanistan, the Taliban is reportedly searching for people who have worked with U.S. and NATO forces. Citing documents drawn up by the UN, the BBC reported that the country's new rulers are stepping up the search. It also described that the militants are threatening to arrest or kill people who work in the military, police, and investigative agencies. This is in stark contrast to what was said earlier, as Taliban leaders had promised they would not attack those who had worked with the government or the US-led coalition. Local news agency Kama Press has also reported that the capital Kabul has an overnight curfew in place and no one is allowed to leave their homes after 9 p.m. except in emergency cases. Marking the country's Independence Day, the Taliban declared it had beaten the US, which it called, quote, "the arrogant power of the world." The group also declared that the country is now the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the name used when it ruled the country brutally in the late 1990s, adding that they wish to forge friendly ties with other countries around the world. Against this backdrop, chaotic evacuation continues on the ground in Afghanistan, with the U.S. military saying that it has evacuated nearly 6,000 people during the past week or so. Meanwhile, the G7 foreign ministers are urging the Taliban to ensure the safety of people evacuating Afghanistan while vowing to exert all possible efforts to help the vulnerable escape from the country. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
America's sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan has called into question, in some quarters, Washington's commitment to defending its allies. But President Biden and other officials are saying that when it comes to other countries, including South Korea, the situation is fundamentally different. Jang Tae-hyun reports.
U.S. President Joe Biden is insisting that Washington's allies like South Korea, Taiwan, and European countries are fundamentally different from Afghanistan in terms of U.S. security commitment and don't have to worry despite the developments seen over the past few days. He made the remarks during an interview with ABC that aired in the U.S. on Wednesday local time. His comments come as concerns are rising over Biden's decision to suddenly pull American troops out of Afghanistan, which was quickly retaken by the Taliban. President Biden claimed there's a fundamental difference between Taiwan, South Korea, and NATO, adding the U.S. has made agreements with those with a unity government not based on a civil war. Biden stressed the U.S. is trying to keep bad guys from doing bad things to them. He also emphasized that the U.S. has kept every commitment it has given to its allies. President Biden noted how the White House made a sacred commitment to NATO's Article 5, which means if anyone invades or takes action against another NATO member, the U.S. will respond. That goes for South Korea as well. In the meantime, U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price said Thursday that, quote, "It's safe to say that this administration has prioritized our system of alliances and partnerships in profound ways, and we've done that because we recognize them as a profound source of strength." He added that this is the reason Secretary Blinken has consulted with NATO allies because when it comes to Afghanistan, they're making decisions in close coordination. Jang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
The South Korean government has decided to designate as a national folklore cultural heritage a collection of children's clothing from the late Joseon Dynasty. According to the Cultural Heritage Administration, this set of 9 garments are believed to have been made around the turn of the 20th century for the last crown prince of the Korean Empire, Lee-eun. There's no evidence the crown prince actually wore the clothes, but they give an insight into life among the royal family at that time. The clothes were donated to Sookmyung Women's University in 1998 and are said to have been kept by the Crown Princess. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.